All right, I got about half hour to do some reading and reflecting from chapter 1 of the Mystical Theology of the Eastern Church by Vladimir Lossky. And I like this chapter because it goes into some important, distinctions between the Orthodox, the Eastern Church, and the Western Church, its origins, its significance. It talks about the relationship between mysticism and theology, which in the Eastern Orthodox churches they go hand in hand. They're not bifurcated, and a lot of other interesting paragraphs that I'm just going to reflect on as I go through them. So I hope you guys enjoy. So it begins. It is our intention in the following essay to study certain aspects of Eastern spirituality in relation to the fundamental themes of the Orthodox dogmatic tradition. In the present work, therefore, the term mystical theology denotes no more than a spirituality which expresses a doctrinal attitude. This is an important thing that I think is difficult for most to wrap their heads around, because the term dogma has been, rightfully frowned upon, at least from a kind of a scientific perspective, right? But I think the term dogma here, you need to get past that, and then what it means will kind of disclose itself to you as you read along and as you explore. If the mystical aspect is this transcendent experience, the dogmatic aspect is the incarnation of or the inculcation of this mystical experience into the physical, which is necessarily not going to be. It's going to be difficult to pinpoint accurately and assess its validity for the masses of the population without going through the certain initiatory processes or becoming a member of the church. So, sorry. Continuing on, in a certain sense, all theology is mystical, inasmuch as it shows forth the divine mystery, the data of revelation. I like that sentence there. So all theology is mystical, inasmuch as it shows forth the divine mystery, which he says is the data of revelation. On the other hand, mysticism is frequently opposed to theology as a realm inaccessible to understanding, as an unutterable mystery, a hidden depth to be lived rather than known, yielding itself to a specific experience which surpasses our faculties of understanding rather than to any perception of sense or intelligence. So this is the idea that we see in kind of New Age mysticism, where I have it's very Gnostic. If you have mysticism without theology and praxis, it becomes very, very Gnostic, where certain few elect have this direct knowledge of God, and the rest are kind of out of luck. That's not what Lossky is saying here is present in the Orthodox ethos. There's a marriage of mysticism and theology. Back to the text. If we adopted this latter conception unreservedly, resolutely opposing mysticism to theology, we should be led, in the last resort, to the thesis of Bergson. He's talking about Henri Bergson, who was a philosopher, French philosopher, early 19th century, who distinguishes in his Dos Sources the static religion of the churches from the dynamic religion of the mystics. The former, social and conservative, so the churches, social and conservative in character, and the latter, the mystics, personal and creative. So this juxtaposition that Bergson points out between the active and the static aspects, theological aspects here. Lossky says, to what extent was Bergson justified in stating this opposition? This is a difficult question, all the more so since the two terms which Bergson opposes on the religious plane are rooted in the two poles of his philosophical vision of the universe, nature and the élan vital. So nature would be akin to the conservative nature of the churches, and the élan vital, the vitality, would be more akin to the vitality of the mystics. Continuing, quite apart from this attitude of Bergson, however, one frequently hears expressed the view which would see in mysticism a realm reserved for the few, an exception to the common rule, a privilege vouchsafed to a few souls who enjoy direct experience of the truth, others, meanwhile, having to rest content with a more or less blind submission to dogmas imposed from without as to a coercive authority. So what this critique that he's rebutting here is the transhumanist and this kind of techno-utopian mindset. At least that's what's coming up for me here. This opposition is sometimes carried to great lengths, especially if the historical reality be forced into a preconceived pattern. Thus, the mystics are set up against the theologians, the contemplatives against the prelates, the saints against the church. It will suffice to recall many a passage of Harnack, Paul Sabatier's Life of St. Francis, and other works most frequently by Protestant historians. The Eastern tradition has never made a sharp distinction between mysticism and theology, between personal experience of the divine mysteries and the dogma affirmed by the Church. The following words, spoken a century ago by the great Orthodox theologian, the Metropolitan Philaret of Moscow, expresses this attitude perfectly. Quote, "None of the mysteries of the most secret wisdom of God ought to appear alien or altogether transcendent to us. But in all humility, we must apply our spirit to the contemplation of divine things." Close quote. To put it another way, we must live the dogma expressing a revealed truth, which appears to us as an unfathomable mystery, in such a fashion that instead of assimilating the mystery to our own mode of understanding, we should, on the contrary, look for a profound change, an inner transformation of spirit, enabling us to experience it mystically. That was a very profound statement there. So, live the dogma expressing the revealed truth in such a fashion that there's a transformation that happens in the heart, which then discloses more of the mystical aspects, but not in the sense of a Gnostic sense of having information that is somehow gives you more power. I think that type of transformation drives the humility and kind of shares and spreads this Christian ethos mindset. He continues, "Far from being mutually opposed, theology and mysticism support and complete each other. One is impossible without the other. If the mystical experience is a personal working out of the content of the common faith, theology is an expression for the profit of all, of that which can be experienced by everyone. Outside the truth kept by the whole church, personal experience would be deprived of all certainty, of all objectivity. It would be a mingling of truth and falsehood, of reality and illusion. Mysticism, in the bad sense of the word." So he's saying that mysticism in this negative sense is this mingling of truth and falsehood, right? Which we know in terms of doublespeak and what we're experiencing right now with the hollowing out of words. Again, I see a Gnostic influence rearing its head, and he talks here just a bit in this introduction about the heresies and the challenges the church has faced since its inception from the Gnostics and from other sects and cults. So that's what kind of came up for me as I was reading that. Yeah, what was I here? It would be a mingling of truth and falsehood, of reality and of illusion, mysticism in the bad sense of the word. On the other hand, the teaching of the church would have no hold on souls if it did not in some degree express an inner experience of truth, granted in different measure to each one of the faithful. There is therefore no Christian mysticism without theology. But above all, there is no theology without mysticism. It is not by chance that the tradition of the Eastern Church has reserved the name of theologian peculiarly for three sacred writers, of whom the first is St. John, most mystical of the four evangelists, the second St. Gregory Nazianzen, writer of contemplative poetry, and the third St. Simeon, called the new theologian, the singer of union with God. Mysticism is accordingly treated in the present work as the perfecting and crown of all theology, a theology par excellence. All right, next we're going to get into the Gnostic forces that have been battling the church. So he continues, unlike Gnosticism, in which knowledge for its own sake constitutes the aim of the Gnostic, Christian theology is always, in the last resort, a means, a unity of knowledge, of knowledge subserving an end which transcends all knowledge. This ultimate end is union with God or deification, the theosis of the Greek fathers. Thus, we are finally led to a conclusion which may seem paradoxical enough, that Christian theory should have an eminently practical significance, and that the more mystical it is, the more directly it aspires to the supreme end of the union with God, right? So that we have a kind of an antinomy forming here. All the development of the dogmatic battles which the church was waged down the centuries appears to us, if we regard it from a purely spiritual standpoint, as dominated by the constant preoccupation with the church has had to safeguard at each moment of her history for all Christians the possibility of attaining to the fullness of the mystical union. So that's what's been preserved through the millennia in terms of all of the different iterations and challenges that the church has faced, existential challenges. So the church struggled against the Gnostics in defense of this same idea of deification as the universal end. Quote, God became man that man might become gods, close quote. The church, affirmed against the Arians, now here are the heresies here, against the Arians, the dogma of the consubstantial Trinity, for it is the Word, the Logos, who opens to us the way to union with the Godhead. And if the incarnate Word has not the same substance with the Father, if he be not truly God, or our deification is impossible. So it kind of solidified the both divine and human quality of Christ and the necessity of such in order for the redemption of humanity as a whole. So there's an interesting spiritual physical link there that's important, that's persevered and has been preserved through the millennia. The church condemned the Nestorians that she might overthrow the middle wall of partition whereby, in the person of Christ himself, they would have separated God from man. She rose up against the Apollinarians and Monophysites to show that since the fullness of true human nature has been assumed by the Word, it is our whole humanity that must enter into union with God. She warred with the Monothelites because apart from the union of the two wills, the divine and the human, there could be no attaining to deification. God created man by his will alone, and he cannot save him without the cooperation of the human will. I think this is a really important distinction we see from kind of popular spirituality, where the body is discarded, the ego is even discarded, the psychological instantiation of the body for the spirit, which from a Gnostic perspective is trapped in this lower density, these lower forms of material existence. Continuing here, the church emerged triumphant from the iconoclastic controversy, affirming the possibility of the expression through a material medium of the divine realities, symbol and pledge of our sanctification. The main preoccupation, the issue at stake in the questions which successively arise respecting the Holy Spirit, grace, and the church herself, this last, the dogmatic question of our own time, is always the possibility, the manner, or the means of our union with God. All the history of Christian dogma unfolds itself about this mystical center, guarded by different weapons against its many and diverse assailants in the course of successive ages. Another beautiful treasure here, after the emergence of the icon as an expression of the divine, because of the incarnation of the Word, it's a profound thing to think about. The theological doctrines which have been elaborated in the course of these struggles can be treated in the most direct relation to the vital end, that of union with God, to the attainment of which they are subservient. Thus they appear as the foundations of Christian spirituality. It is this that we shall understand in speaking of mystical theology. Not mysticism properly so called, the personal experiences of different masters of the spiritual life. Such experiences, for that matter, more often than not, remain inaccessible to us. even though they may find verbal expression. What in reality can one say of the mystical experiences of St. Paul, quote, I knew a man in Christ above 14 years ago. Whether in body, I cannot tell, or whether out of body, I cannot tell. God knoweth. Such an one caught up in the third heaven. And I knew such a man, whether in body or out of the body, I cannot tell, God knoweth, how that he was caught up into paradise and heard unspeakable words, which it is not lawful for man to utter. Close quote. To venture to pass any judgment upon the nature of this experience, it would be necessary to understand it more fully than did St. Paul, who avows his ignorance, quote, I cannot tell, God knoweth. We deliberately leave on one side all questions of mystical psychology, nor is it theological doctrines as such that we propose to set forth in the present work, but only such elements of theology as are indispensable for our understanding of a spirituality, the dogmas which constitute the foundation of mysticism. Here, then, it is the first definition, the limitation of our subject, which is the mystical theology of the Eastern Church. All right, next, we're going to get into the schism and kind of the nature and occurrence of the separation of the Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox and the Western Church in 1050. That's the second limitation, he says here. So the second limitation circumscribes our subject, so to say, in space. It is the Christian East, or more precisely the Eastern Orthodox Church, which will form the field of our studies in mystical theology. We must recognize that this limitation is somewhat artificial. In reality, since the cleavage between East and West only dates from the middle of the 11th century, all that is prior to this date constitutes a common and indivisible treasure for both parts of a divided Christendom. The Orthodox Church would not be what it is today if it did not have St. Cyprian, St. Augustine, and St. Gregory the Great. No more could the Roman Catholic Church do without St. Athanasius, St. Basil, or St. Cyril of Alexandria. Thus, when one would speak of the mystical theology of the East or of the West, one takes one's stand within one of the two traditions which remained, down to a certain moment, two local traditions within the one church, witnessing to a single Christian truth, but which subsequently part the one from the other and give rise to two different dogmatic attitudes, irreconcilable on several points. Can we judge the two traditions by taking our stand on a neutral ground equally foreign to the one as to the other? So it's an intriguing question. Can we, outside of the Eastern Church or the Western Church, place a judgment on the nature of the differences in the validity of them? He says that would be to judge Christianity from a non-Christian standpoint. In other words, to refuse in advance to understand anything whatever about the object of study. For objectivity, and this is a very interesting point, for objectivity in no wise consists in taking one's stand outside an object, but on the contrary, in considering one's object in itself and by itself. There are fields in which what is commonly styled objectivity is only indifference, and where indifference means incomprehension. In the present state of dogmatic difference between East and West, it is essential, if one wishes to study the mystical theology of the Eastern Church, to choose between two possible standpoints, either to place oneself on Western dogmatic ground and examine the Eastern tradition across that of the West, that is, by the way of criticism, or else to present that tradition in the light of the dogmatic attitude of the Eastern Church. This latter course is for us the only possible one. I want to back up a little here, and he gave I think a beautiful and subtle critique of scientism in his rejection of judging the East and Western churches from an objective, neutral point, because the term objectivity, he says, is not that one is disinterested in what the object is. One has to, from a Christian perspective, one has to know the object. So this idea of this cold, sterile abstraction of modern science, where you have a scientist that's, completely taken out of context of its infatuation, its relationship, its reason for studying what it studies, right? That is a type of objectivity that he is saying here that is only indifference, his critique, and where indifference means incomprehension. I found that an interesting critique, and I could think of some interesting rebuttals there. But I think what we're seeing, and or butting up against the limits of our science, we have been, from quantum mechanics. I mean, you name it. There's a certain threshold where we stop being able to make progress, except kind of in the technological space. But that's due to an inherent category error of the scientist towards its subject. There needs to be a reorientation of love and of sanctity in the relationship to the study of the natural world. I think that's what is needed. And in saying that, we're so far away from that. It's like, or are we? All right, I'll read a couple more. Let me know if you guys like this. I'll read a little bit. I got a little bit more time here. So he says, it will perhaps be objected that the dogmatic dissension between East and West only arose by chance, that it has not been of decisive importance, that it was rather a question of two different historical spheres, which must sooner or later have separated in order that each might follow its own path, and finally, that the dogmatic dispute was no more than a pretext for the breaking asunder once and for all of an ecclesiastical unity which had in fact long ceased to be reality. So he's bringing up the historical contingent result here, or the critique. Such assertions, which are heard very frequently in the East as in the West, are the outcome of a purely secular mentality and of widespread habit of treating church history according to methods which exclude the religious nature of the church. For the historian of the church, the religious factor disappears and finds itself displaced by others, such, for instance, as the play of political or social interests, the part played by racial or cultural conditions, considered as determining factors in the life of the church. We think ourselves shrewder, more up to date in invoking these factors as the true guiding forces of ecclesiastical history. While recognizing their importance, a Christian historian can scarcely resign himself to regarding them otherwise than as accidental to the essential nature of the church. He cannot cease to see in the church an autonomous body subject to a different law, that of the determinism of this world. If we consider the dogmatic question of the procession of the Holy Spirit, which divided East and West, we cannot treat it as a fortuitous phenomenon in the history of the church. So because of the Holy Spirit, right, we cannot just say it's a contingent historical event. From the religious point of view, it is the sole issue of importance in the chain of events which terminated in the separation. Conditioned as it may well have been by various factors, this dogmatic choice was, for the one party as for the other, a spiritual commitment, a conscious taking of sides in a matter of faith. If we are often led to minimize the importance of the dogmatic question, which determined all the subsequent developments of the two traditions, this is by reason of a certain insensitivity toward dogma, which is considered as something external and abstract. It is said that it is spirituality which matters. The dogmatic difference is of no consequence. So he's bringing up another modern instantiation, theological instantiation to critique here, and I think he does well in explicating here. So he's saying that the dogma that's critiqued, right, is looked at as external and abstract, when the dogma is rooted, incarnated, and is inhabits the very peoples and histories and through time that it operates through. Right? There's a truth that runs through these distinct cultures and geographical areas that's not bound up completely politically, culturally, historically in those particular regions, if that makes any sense. So continuing here, yet spirituality and dogma, mysticism and theology are inseparably linked in the life of the church. As regards the Eastern Church, we have already remarked that she makes no sharp distinction between theology and mysticism, between the realm of the common faith and that of personal experience. Thus, if we would speak of mystical theology in the Eastern tradition, we cannot do otherwise than consider it within the dogmatic setting of the Orthodox Church. Before coming to grips with our subject, it is necessary to say a few words about the Orthodox Church, little known down to the present day in the West. Father Congar's book, Divided Christendom, though very remarkable in many aspects, remains, despite all his striving after objectivity, subject in those pages which he devotes to the Orthodox Church to certain preconceived notions. So he's saying that this well thought out book has its limitations. The book is Divided Christendom by Father Congar. Quote, where the West, he says, on the basis at once developed and narrow of Augustinian ideology, claimed for the church independence in life and organization, and thus laid down the lines of a very definite ecclesiology, the East settled down in practice, and to some extent in theory, to a principle of unity which was political, non-religious, and not truly universal. So that is the critique of the East that he's looking to explore here. Right. To Father Congar, as to the majority of Catholic and Protestant writers who have expressed themselves on this subject, Orthodoxy presents itself under the form of a federation of national churches, having at its basis a political principle, the state church. So this is he's kind of steel-manning the argument from the other side here. The idea that Orthodoxy is more kind of included and in line with political principles, right? So you have the state churches that kind of critique. One can venture upon such generalizations as these only by ignoring both the canonical groundwork and the history of the Eastern Church. The view which would base the unity of a local church on a political, racial, or cultural principle is considered by the Orthodox Church as a heresy, specifically known in the name of Philitism. So he's saying that this very critique is actually heresy in the Orthodox ethos. It is the ecclesiastical territory, the area sanctified by more or less ancient Christian tradition, which forms the basis of a metropolitan province. So now he's given a response. Administered by an archbishop or metropolitan, with the bishops from every diocese coming together from time to time in a synod. So he's giving you the structure here. If metropolitan provinces are grouped together to form local churches under the jurisdiction of a bishop, who often bears the title of patriarch, it is still the community of local tradition and historical destiny, as well as convincing in calling together a council from many provinces, which determines the formation of these large circles or jurisdictions, the territories of which do not necessarily correspond to the political boundaries of a state. He gives some examples here. So he's showing how this, the leaven of Eastern Orthodoxy, as it goes through and transfigures different areas, that it's not reduced to the political instantiations of the contingent area, right? And some examples here. The Patriarch of Constantinople enjoys a certain primacy of honor, arbitrating from time to time in disputes, but without exercising a jurisdiction over the whole body of the ecumenical church. The local churches of the East had more or less the same attitude toward the Apostolic Patriarchate of Rome, first see of the church before the separation and symbol of her church. The unity of the church expresses itself through the communion of the heads of local churches among themselves by the agreement of all the churches in regard to the local council, which thus acquires a universal import. Finally, in exceptional cases, it may manifest itself through a general council, and these are the 7 ecumenical councils. The Catholicity of the church, right? Catholicity means its unity, its wholeness. Far from being the privilege of any one see or specific center, is realized rather in the richness and multiplicity of the local traditions which bear witness unanimously to a single truth, to that which is preserved always, everywhere, and by all. Since the church is Catholic in all her parts, each one of her members, not only the clergy, but also the layman, is called to confess and to defend the truth of tradition, opposing even the bishops should they fall into heresy. A Christian who has received the gift of the Holy Spirit and the sacrament of the Holy Chrism must have full awareness of his faith. He is always responsible for the church. Hence the restless and sometimes agitated character of the ecclesiastical life of Byzantium, of Russia, and of other countries in the Orthodox world. This, however, is the price paid for a religious vitality, an intensity of spiritual life which penetrates the whole mass of believers, united in the awareness that they form a single body with the hierarchy of the Church. From this, too, comes the unconquerable energy which enables orthodoxy to go through all trials, all cataclysms and upheavals, adapting itself continually to the new historical reality and showing itself stronger than outward circumstances. The persecutions of the faithful in Russia, the systematic fury of which has not been able to destroy the Church, are the best witnesses to power which is not of this world. I think that's beautifully said, and I think there are bigger challenges to come. So buckle up. A little bit more here. So the Orthodox Church, though commonly referred to as Eastern, considers itself nonetheless the universal church. And this is true in the same that she is not limited by any particular type of culture, by the legacy of any one civilization, Hellenic or otherwise, or by strictly Eastern cultural forms. Moreover, Eastern can mean so many things. From the cultural point of view, the East is less homogeneous than the West. What have Hellenism and Russia culture in common, notwithstanding the Byzantine origins of Christianity in Russia? Orthodoxy has been the leaven in too many different cultures to be itself considered a cultural form of Eastern Christianity. The forms are different. The faith is one. The Orthodox Church has never confronted national cultures with another which could be regarded as specifically Orthodox. It is for this reason that her missionary work has been able to expand so prodigiously. Witness the conversion, and here's a wonderfully put examples, right? Witness the conversion of Russia to Christianity during the 10th and 11th century, and at a later date, the preaching of the gospel across the whole of Asia. Towards the end of the 18th century, Orthodox missions reached the Aleutian Islands and Alaska, passed thence to North America, creating new dioceses of the Russian Church beyond the confines of Russia, spreading to China and Japan. The anthropological and cultural variations which one encounters from Greece to the remotest parts of Asia and from Egypt to the Arctic do not destroy the homogeneous character of this kinship of spirituality, very different from that of the Christian West. I'm going to leave it there. I don't want to make this too long. I hope you guys enjoyed this, and I will be with you guys soon. God bless.